expansion video. This is going to wrap up our lecture series, which of course there's only two on the topic. We're going to basically be focusing on the effects of European expansion, specifically on the areas of South America, Africa, and Asia. Let's get into it. In our last lecture video, we had talked about how smallpox and other diseases had played a major role in the ability of the Spanish to conquer the natives of South America and Central America. So that's where we're going to kind of be there now. I just want to take a look here. Basically, the effect was basically about 1/3 of the population of the Native Americans in those areas died from diseases like smallpox, typhus, the flu, and measles. Now keep in mind, these are things that still kill people today. These are things that were still killing Europeans back then. But the difference is that you had Europeans who had built up immunities to them, where in the Americas these diseases are brand new and people start dying from them because they haven't built up any resistance to them. You can kind of make some comparisons to today when we have COVID, where you have a bunch of people who have never been exposed to them, and then you can see that you have a high death rate. Now, that's not to say that 1/3 of the people who die, not 1/3 of the population is dying from COVID, so imagine how much more serious of a problem this was back then, because COVID has like a 99% survival rate, where 1/3 of a population is dying to these diseases back in the during European exploration. So what are some of the results that we end up having because of these diseases that come in? Well, you end up having a shortage of workers. And so what that ends up resulting in too, the other effects is that the people who are needed to grow food are no longer there. And then when you don't have people to grow the food, you have a shortage of food. And then of course, when you don't have enough food, you end up with starvation. So other things that have to happen too is we have to find a way to replace those workers. And so one of the groups that we look at to try and replace those workers are going to be African slaves. Okay, so Africans, you have to keep in mind too that that group of people, they've been trading with Europeans and have had exposure to Europeans for many years at this point, and they don't get affected by disease as badly as the Native Americans would, at least as far as those that are, concerned with coming from Europe. Now, Africans are going to have issues when they come to the Americas, just like Europeans did, where they're dying from new diseases that they're being exposed to with the as far as ones that are native to the Americas. Okay. So some other things to look at too is that we have a focus of new rivals on the world stage. There's going to be there's going to be about 3 or 4 rivals on the world stage. We're going to have Great Britain, we're going to have the Dutch, we're going to have the Portuguese, and we're going to have the French. I know I didn't include the fourth country there on the flag, but so France is missing there. But those are going to be the ones who become the major competitors as far as European expansion. I previewed in the last lecture that Portugal would basically fall off because of issues like their size. Their geographic size is very small, and when you have that, you're limited in terms of manpower and as much money as you can generate. So basically, doing this lecture at 5 in the morning. So basically, you're going to lose out to countries like Great Britain and France and Spain, because they have a lot more size in terms of geography, and because of that, they have more manpower and more money. Okay. Let's talk about Africa and the slave trade. So Portugal, as we've talked before, start to lose influence, and the Dutch are the ones that start to replace them in Asia. So what ends up happening is all the forts and places that the Portuguese had, all the forts that the Portuguese had set up in their areas trying to get to Asia, those are taken over by the Dutch. The Dutch also do some things like setting up colonies in South Africa. Some of the things too that kind of play a recurring theme in this lecture series is that coastal cities, coastal regions, coastal states, African states, aren't really impacted by slave trade because they're the ones that end up doing the trade with the Europeans. It's going to be the ones on the interior that are affected. So basically what's going to happen, and I'm going to end up repeating this again later, but is you would have the coastal states would basically end up getting the guns and all the other manufactured goods, and then they would take them, go and conduct wars and raids on African nations on the interior of Africa, and then basically round up captives and then use them to sell for more guns and more manufactured goods. They were basically a source of income for African nations. So, a lot of students, when they take this class, that's kind of a surprise for them. One of the misconceptions that students have a lot of times is that the African slave trade was just Europeans coming in and doing all the rounding up themselves, when actually it was a cooperation between Europeans and African kingdoms to basically go in and round up slaves. Okay, so some origins of the slave trade. Initially the Portuguese were using slaves. We had talked about them in the first lecture. They were using them as house servants and agricultural workers. But then, as we said, all right, I gotta start doing these earlier. But then, as we said, you have this absence of workforce in the Americas, and so then we end up using Africans to fill that void. And the main jobs that they were doing in the Americas is they were being used for farming for sugarcane plantations, because there's a giant demand for that. So the Native Americans that were being used, they've died off, and now they're being replaced by Africans. Growth of the slave trade. Slave trade is a regular feature in triangular trade. Now, if you don't know what triangular trade is, basically it was a continuous cycle where basically manufactured goods were sent to Africa. Then you would take those manufactured goods, trade them for slaves, and then you would take the slaves over to the Americas where they were needed, and you would pick up raw materials. Those raw materials were then sent back to Europe, where they can then turn those into manufactured goods, and you basically just keep going through that cycle. So you had a great number of slaves that were brought over from Africa to the Americas, and the reason why you needed more than what was actually needed, if that makes sense, is because a lot of slaves would end up dying along the journey. So you have all these individuals who are packed into places where you can't stand up. We're talking hundreds of days, 100 days or more, being cramped inside of a ship where there's very little air quality. There's poor air quality. You can't move. Very filthy. There's no place to use the bathroom. Basically, it's covered in filth. And then if you did survive, you were basically either worked to death. If you're lucky, you survive, if you want to say that, because some people would say death is more fortunate than being a slave. You had the diseases that Africans hadn't been exposed to that were around in the Americas, so then they would have problems with that too. Africans did have children, and those children, as they grew up, were healthier because they were basically born and developed immunities. But the problem here is that Europeans didn't encourage slaves to have children because they thought it was too expensive to raise children. In terms of slaves, it was just cheaper to go out and buy new ones and replace them. So there wasn't a whole lot of childbearing amongst slaves during that time. Conduct of the slave trade. African slave traders were willing to trade with Europeans for manufactured goods. So once again, this was a cooperation between Africans and Europeans. Usually slave traders got their supplies from local regions. And of course, as demand increases, they start pushing further and further inland in Africa to try and refresh their stock. And African kings on the coastal areas were more than happy to do this because trading their fellow Africans for manufactured goods was a source of income. So African rulers were basically authorized for raids and wars to occur for the simple fact that they needed to have slaves to trade with European traders. Effects of slave trade. Obviously, we know that some of the easy things to identify are going to be the fact that people were impacted by slavery. But there are some other things that aren't so obvious to the everyday person as far as slavery is concerned with impacts. If you don't know what the cottage industry is basically that's the early forms of industrialization. Basically, the process of producing things were done inside the home, hence the name the cottage, because factories hadn't been invented yet until we ended up with the Industrial Revolution in the 1800s. But because the European nations are so good at producing these goods, and they do it at a cheaper they can sell them at a cheaper price and higher quality, what that's doing is it's wiping out any sort of industry that's within Africa. So we end up taking all these individuals and families that were working through the cottage system and making money off of it. We basically ruin them financially and turn them into poverty. There are political effects too, as we mentioned in the previous part of the lecture. We end up having a lot of wars that end up being declared and fighting between the African nations because they need a fresh supply of slaves. Of course, that's also going to tie into the fact that we have population loss. There aren't any records, or there's poorly kept records to try and support this, but the general idea is that we end up having negative population growth in Africa because the amount of slaves that are taken from Africa to the other parts of the world. You do have some white guilt with Europeans, but we don't end up having enough of it where we can have a positive impact on getting rid of slavery. The first group of Europeans, or I guess you could say whites, that would be against slavery would be the Dutch, so it would be the Quakers. If you're not familiar with Quakers, just look at the Quaker oatmeal guy. That is a picture of what Quakers look like, but they're a religious group, and basically they would disown people who owned slavery, but that doesn't happen until around the 17 or 1800s. Okay. Now we're going to shift focus and talk about what happens in Asia. Spain basically is going to be the one who controls the Philippines, so we have Portugal losing their control there. But really, it's going to be the Dutch that end up taking over a good portion of Southeast Asia with the Philippines, as far as replacing Portugal. Now to backtrack though, with Spain, basically they would use the Philippines as a trading base. They would basically conduct their trade with Mexico using that as their route. So you can basically see that, if you're familiar with geography, you can certainly get to Mexico from the Philippines as long as you're crossing the Pacific Ocean. But back to the Dutch, basically it takes about 50 years for the Dutch to replace the Portuguese as far as a trading presence and power within Eastern Asia. Now, the other thing too is that we're going to basically be looking at European influence in Asia, with the exception of India, is only really felt on the islands. The mainlands were able to resist European influence because they had strong monarchies. China is very influential as far as keeping Europeans out, because they had rules where they could only trade with Europeans on an isolated island and didn't really grant them access to the mainland. French and British in India. This is going to be something that we come back to later on, but just for now, you have three countries that are really involved in India at first. That's the Dutch, the British, and the French. But the Dutch end up abandoning their desires and motivations in terms of India to focus more on the spice trade in the island areas. So that leaves the British and the French, and the British end up winning out because of two major reasons. They have some military leaders who are really, really effective. They also have, they're also fortunate where France doesn't, it seems like they don't really take it serious enough, because the French monarchy doesn't provide the adequate money to try and take over India. So what we end up having is the British control India, and they're going to control India until about 1950 or 60 or so. It's something that we won't even cover until almost we're done with the course, where you end up having India gaining their independence. But at least as the early goings, we end up having the British East India Company that's created, that takes control of India and governs on behalf of the British government. As far as China, we already talked about them just a little bit ago. China is able to resist early advances because they're a strong monarchy. And then, of course, we only allow trade on a remote island, so there's very limited access for Europeans to get in, and so the amount of damage that they could do to China is, I feel like China is very limited. So eventually the Chinese, though, as we start going on in the course, when we start talking about the 1800s and early 1900s, China isn't able to resist European influence, and the United States actually gets involved in terms of disrupting what's going on inside of China, all for the sake of trade. So, getting into Japan, we're almost done here. Japan, we're talking about an island nation. They don't have a whole lot of influence from Europeans either. Now, at first, they go ahead and welcome them because Japanese, the nobles and the wealthy are very interested in trading for some of these manufactured goods, things like clocks and glasses and things like that. But the problem is that Europeans quickly wear out their welcome, and that's going to come from the form of the missionaries. The missionaries come in, and it's not so much of a big deal the fact that they're converting people to Christianity. The problem becomes when the missionaries start becoming involved in local politics. When that happens, the local rulers begin to take exception to it and throw the missionaries out, and in some cases start murdering and killing, same thing, those who had converted to Christianity. The only group of traders who are allowed to stay are going to be the Dutch, and the only reason for that is because they were the only group that did not send missionaries. Now, as far as the conquer go, we've got native, all these different effects that are going on. You've got the Native Americans, their culture, their political institution are all wiped out. Africa, we've talked about before, where they have serious population loss. Specifically in South America and Central America, we have a multicultural development that arises. You have Europeans who arrive. There aren't a lot of women around that are Europeans, so we end up having this mixing of Europeans and natives, and also Europeans and Africans. So if we have Europeans and Native Americans, they were referred to as mestizos as far as South America and Central America is called. And then if you had a European mixed with an African, we were referring to those as mulattoes. Other things that happen, we have changing ecology. So we have, because of triangular trade, we have some things that occur with corn was the main crop of South America, but that ends up being replaced for the most part by sugarcane because it's more profitable. And then we also have a case where cows, cattle, and horses come to the Americas too. They hadn't existed there before, and South America is a very good area for you to do cattle raising. So what ends up happening is cattle becomes one of the major exports in terms of beef for South America. So that's pretty impressive considering that cattle didn't exist there prior to the Europeans arriving. We have corn also makes its way into Europe too, but for the most part we're just talking about effects of the slave trade on other areas, or effects of European expansion on other areas. When we're talking about ecology, we just focus on the things that replace what was inside of South America. We also have the creation of Catholic missionaries. So remember that you have Spain and Portugal are really big on the spreading of Christianity. And so missionaries basically are built, they're like these big fortress type things. And they basically act as a community where the local indigenous people would come and they could receive training and education and learn Christianity and convert them. It also, because they're built like fortresses, act like military bases, which are advantages for those countries in terms of frontier areas. So the other things that Catholic institutions did in terms of work in the Americas is they created schools and hospitals. They also provide avenues for women that were outside of marriage, because you have the nunneries and jobs that women can do within the church that were specific to female roles. Now, as far as the conquerors, this is going to be our last topic. You have opportunities to earn money, land, and social status for Europeans. There are opportunities for European women. I have a little, slide, cartoon woman, ugly woman up there. That's because, again, as we mentioned before, there's a lack of European women. So women were trying the best they could, women who could not get married, to come over to the Americas, because your chances drastically increase as far as finding a husband, because there aren't as many women over as far as Europeans in the Americas. So you might get lucky if you can't find one in Europe because you're not that attractive. You might hit the lotto when you get to the Americas. So some other things too that get affected. We talked before about the price revolution, where because you had all this influx of silver and other precious metals into Europe, we had the price revolution, which was an increase in the inflation of prices. And if you need to know about the negative impacts of the price revolution, you can check that out in the other video. Other things that end up coming too, we have potatoes that end up making their way from the Americas into Europe, and what that does is that ends up increasing the diet, the nutrition that Europeans are able to get. So we'll cover the potato famine, which is hits Ireland, but that's many months down the road when we end up getting to that. But it is an advantage to have things like that come over. Other things that end up coming over to Europe too that's advantageous for Europeans would be things like tea and coffee. Now, tea doesn't necessarily come from the Americas, I don't believe. I believe that's more of an Asian thing. It could be wrong. I'm not going to look that up right now. But with the influx of tea and coffee, you have the creation of coffee and tea houses as well. And so that's pretty much it. We see that Europe greatly benefits from all this expansion, and it's at the expense of pretty much everyone else. And that's going to wrap up our little lecture series on European expansion. So hopefully you are able to get the information you need out of this to be successful in the course. And so next time, the next part in the lecture series we're going to do is we're going to be focusing on Reformation and Martin Luther, which is personally one of my favorite subjects to cover every year. So hopefully you get some enjoyment out of that too. We'll see you next time.